Hello, everyone, and welcome to JSA TV and JSA Europe, the newsroom for telecom and data center professionals across the continent. I'm João Marques Lima, and on behalf of the team here at JSA, thank you for tuning in to the first of three parts of our end of the year special broadcasting series. Today, we'll be looking at the future powerhouses of Europe, aka data centers. We will delve into the geographic locations on the rise in the digital infrastructure, connectivity, and data center space across the region, as well as the benefits of these new destinations, the role of the upcoming regulations affecting many of the EU territories, and what to look out for in the new year. Having said that, it is now my pleasure to introduce our exceptional executive lineup, which includes Tom Glover, Head of Data Center Transactions for EMEA at JLL, David Hall, Senior Vice President of Colocation for Atlas Edge, and Matthew Baines, Vice President for Design and Construction Partners for the Cloud and Service Provider segment at Schneider Electric. Everyone, thanks so much for joining me. I thought before we jump on questions, I thought if you could just give us a very quick elevator pitch on what you do and what the company focuses on. It just gives our viewers a bit of a background on the things that the company does. Maybe start with you, Tom, and then we go around. And then, so what's your elevator pitch?
The 30 seconds. So JLL is well known as a real estate organization, but within the data center arena specifically, we act on behalf of operators, on behalf of cloud providers, on behalf of investments and developers, investment funds, across a whole plethora of different areas on the transactional front, from finding sites to buying companies, to advisory work, to research, and then flip across to the facilities management part of our business as well. Pretty much everything except actually owning any data centers is perhaps the elevator pitch for JLL, and that's what I'm responsible for. It's the transactional side.
Almost like the Airbnb model in a very different way, but you know what I mean.
I do.
David.
Hi, Joe. Yeah, so I describe Atlas Edge as the world's, maybe controversially, the world's only real edge data center business. And what I mean by that, we're real because we're not a software or network business. We're really building and buying data centers to expand our reach. Real because we're really on the edge of the network, and that's kind of what we mean by edge. And that's partly thanks to some of our investors, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Real because we've got real customers who actually pay us, and real because we're really generating returns for our investors. So it's kind of the snapshot of Atlas Edge's business, I guess.
Yeah, and I think actually nowadays it's important to say that you're real because you do have real estate assets. And you have there's a lot of people out there, they say they exist, but there's nothing to show. But we won't get through that one today. And then Matthew.
Yeah, hi Joe. Hello everybody. And David, you are real because I've seen you in real life, so we believe you. Don't worry. Yeah. Schneider Electric, we're a global, let's say a manufacturer technology company. We are French headquartered, but we are a global company. You could say. We're a manufacturer of data center solutions offers in terms of hardware, but not just that. We are also a big software company in terms of the management of your data centers as well. But actually, what we really try and do is empower our customers to make the most of their energy and their resources. And really, it's to position ourselves to be your digital partner for sustainability and efficiency. And that's on a global scale. We are a global company. I'm based out of London. I have a global role based here in Europe, working with the global cloud and service provider segment team.
And what you do is a very important part of the industry because it actually keeps the lights on in thousands of data centers across the globe and the region, of course. But I think this panel is very exciting because we do have the operational side, we have the energy side, and we have the finance, side of the conversation as well. Tom, you're joining us from Frankfurt. All of us are based in London at the moment. It's the flap markets, so the tier one cities, Frankfurt, London, Paris, Amsterdam and Dublin as well. We've know a lot about them, but what's really in people's minds at the moment, it's the tier two locations, the new up and coming hubs like Milan, Madrid, Warsaw. So my first question really is, what are the new locations across the continent? What's really driving investment in terms of geographies? And I'll open to the floor. I don't know if, Tom, if you want to start or if someone else wants to start.
I'll kick it off. I think you're right. Flap D, everybody's very familiar with them, and they're going nowhere. Let's not kid ourselves. They're going to continue to see growth over the foreseeable future. And not least, I would throw into this thought process because of AI. But putting that to one side, I would say locations like Lisbon, Portugal, locations Madrid, Milan, Italy, Barcelona. You're going to see more developments there. But let's not forget noting the Nordic region, where all these locations, there's been investment, there's been data centers operational for many years. But the Nordics, especially with the advent of the sort of the learning data centers that are going to be driving the growth of AI in the future, I think the Nordics offers a huge potential interest area just because of the climate and the renewable sources of power. So without wanting to grab all of the answer to this one, it's everywhere is interesting. I do not see one country that's not interesting. I including that in the Baltics right now. And we're not even touching on the Middle East and Africa today. We're just talking about Europe, frankly. So it's all exciting. Looking closely at Vienna, looking closely at Madrid, looking closely at Lisbon, looking closely at Barcelona and Milan. They're the key ones, I would say, right now.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I mean, I can only imagine the amount of this training that's going on in boardrooms when it comes to putting pins on the map, because wherever you put a pin, you can actually build something, and surely that you will be able to find someone to anchor the facility. And the Nordics is interesting because, I mean, the Nordics start developing around the mid-2010s, and we've seen a massive boom, especially with the hyperscaler clients. And then it kind of went a bit softer because we've seen the other regions grow, but it's kind of coming into a 2.0 era when it comes to the Nordics. So a lot more people investing in the region. And I really want to get David's and Matthew's view on this as well, especially on the energy side, because I guess that's the biggest UPS of the Nordics, is the energy availability and the pricing of said energy.
Because you just have to hope as a Nordic that no one accidentally cuts any undersea cables, and then you find
yeah.
more secure than you were expecting. It's funny actually, Tom. You talked about pins on the map. So actually, Atlas Edge's name comes from we were thinking about it in terms of putting pins in an atlas, right? So you hit on exactly how we named ourselves. But actually, we have kind of an opposite view, right? So we talk about two kind of motions in the kind of where data centers are being developed. We talk about this cloud out motion. So I guess we all kind of know that the cloud essentially lives in the flat D markets. But if you think about some of those flat markets, they're kind of not really interesting from a GDP perspective. There's not that many Dutch or Irish people. And actually, from a GDP perspective, the Netherlands and Ireland don't actually create much GDP compared with someone like a Germany or a France, right? So actually, we kind of think those markets are certainly sort of fairly saturated, and I think Tom's right. Possibly some new applications might make them more interesting. It's to be determined whether or not those applications are better hosted close to the end users, and I think there's certainly a debate to be had about that. But I think that our expectation certainly is that those markets won't grow as quickly, and it's always hard to grow a market when it's very big, right? But certainly I don't think we see the kind of double-digit growth in those markets that we might expect to see somewhere like a Berlin. So we talk about this kind of cloud out motion, right? So, you know, if you're a cloud provider, you've been able to deliver all your services from Dublin and Amsterdam, right? But there's now applications, whether those are machine learning or whether those are server huggers or whether they're latency sensitive or bandwidth sensitive, that require you to move that cloud closer to your end users. Right, so I think that motion is essentially what we're seeing, kind of primarily driving demand at the moment. Certainly, the places that Tom mentioned, like Lisbon and Berlin and Hamburg and Stuttgart, and Germany is an interesting market because you've got such a distributed GDP. Certainly, where we're looking is where there's big GDP and not many data centers. Right, it's just kind of a logical thing that you might want to do. If there's lots of people, if there's lots of companies, and there's not very many data centers, it seems kind of logical you might want to build some. And then on the other side, it's the kind of edge in motion, right? And I think that that's probably somewhat less developed, but that's kind of saying, well, okay, I don't want data centers in my, in my office anymore, or I don't want data centers in my factory anymore. I benefit from consolidating some of that IT into a data center, which is still quite proximate to my locations and my people, but a bit further away than my office. So I think for us, that's certainly what we see driving demand. But as Tom kind of alluded to, that cloud out motion is massively more significant at the moment than the kind of edge in motion, which I think is why you're seeing certainly us building kind of 20, 30 megawatt sites, not the kind of 500 kilowatt a megawatt sites that you might expect in the kind of far edge moving inwards. But certainly that was the kind of market everyone was talking about 5 years ago, which doesn't seem to have developed yet anyway.
Interesting. And I think just to add to that, I think maybe to a lesser extent at this stage still, and Matthew, I think you're probably going to be able to add on what I'm going to say. But it's also about dispersing the power consumption from the bigger hubs into other parts of the countries, to not supercharge the grids in those more heavy locations. In a way, I don't know, Matthew, what I'm saying, is it correct what I'm saying, or and can you give us a view on the sustainability front and the energy front?
Yeah, I mean, look, just firstly, I echo Tom and David, of course. I mean, David, it's interesting you say in terms of growth, are the core markets going to grow as much as the other markets in terms of CAGR? Probably not. But then it's like the US market, really. Whilst the CAGR may be low, not flat, but low, let's say, they're still building 3,000 megawatts. So there's still a huge demand for new capex investment for data centers in these core markets. And I think it still feels a little bit like, and Tom, you can hear that if you build it, they will come in Frankfurt. If you can get it, they will come at least anyway. So still great markets, of course. But then we're seeing the spillover, I think, into Berlin, for example, and places like that, spillover markets where capacity is constrained. But João, you said around power. I mean, I don't need to talk about it too much. Everybody knows that some of the biggest challenges are land and power in our sector, for sure. People are looking at how they can generate power in core markets, whether through on-site generation, microgrids, hydrogen generators, whatever that might be. But of course, that is difficult. Not always easy to get the permits. Not always easy to negotiate and work with the energy providers, the DNOs, or the regulators, whoever that may be. And sometimes the ROI is a little bit tricky for that as well, in terms of your business case. And your investors might not see that as a best investment to make. Some of the investors we see have a shorter term view than others, of course, as well. So you've got to balance that out. But other markets, tier 2, Tom's mentioned them, David has, for sure. Milan, we're seeing at the moment as a very ripe market. Madrid, Barcelona, Lisbon, you said, and Zurich. Is Zurich still tier 2? I don't know. I don't like the term tier 2 because they're tier 1 in their own country, of course. Major capital markets, let's say. But there are some challenges, I think. I was talking to one major operator where they're saying they're actually going to focus, they're not going to focus, should I say, so much on tier 2. They really want to focus on the major campus sites, and that's where they want to put their energy. There's enough demand there. They can't spread themselves too thin to go into all of the secondary markets, if we just use that term. So there is opportunity, David, for people like Atlas Edge and other players to really hop on and be early adopters in those cities. I think it's fantastic, and it will help breed newcomers and new entrants, perhaps as well, and new investors in that space. Maybe some areas it could be a little trickier to do business with. I do think that, again, some investors, it depends what the fund is, ease of doing business and return and the cost and things. But to finish on what your point was, João, power, of course, is tricky. And then we need Western grade data centers built to Western grade with sustainability in mind, of course, as well. Top of mind, I think there's a question perhaps later on regulation and sustainability as well. So we'll touch on it later.
Yeah, I mean, on the power front, though, I mean, actually, power's hard, right? But you can dig a hole and you eventually can get power, generally speaking. Someone will upgrade a substation and it will come. It may not come exactly where you want it. And I think Madrid, you're looking at like 8 years at the moment, and no one wants to wait 8 years. But actually, the bigger challenge that I foresee, certainly in the flat D markets, is the requirement to recover and reuse heat, right? Because I can build a gigawatt campus in Frankfurt, but if I have to recover and reuse 300 megawatts of heat, I must hope that people want a lot of saunas nearby, because that's a huge amount of heat. And actually, that's going to be certainly in Germany, and as you say, we'll cover it perhaps when we talk a bit more about sustainability. But that's certainly going to be a big challenge where you've got, like, it's less relevant in the US, but Ashburn, Virginia, what are you going to do with 8 gigawatts of heat? Right. So it's an awful lot of heat if you want to recover and reuse it. And I think 30% is the kind of threshold that Germany is setting. But clearly in the future, we're going to look back and wonder why we could console ourselves that PUE was the measure of how efficiently we were boiling the oceans or heating the sky in a world where energy is scarce, right? And I think clearly we're going to want to recover and reuse all our waste heat. And that's certainly going to drive a more distributed data center architecture, I think, just purely because I can get power relatively easily. somewhere in a concentrated hub like Frankfurt or Amsterdam, it's much harder to see how you could recover and reuse the heat. And I think if that German legislation becomes a template in Europe, which I hope it will, that's really going to make it very difficult to substantiate building more data centers in Dublin and Amsterdam.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned PUE. I don't want to open that can of worms now, and I know, Tom, you're very passionate about PUE, but it almost brings the question of, do we need PUE of where we are with things, especially when we look on a global scale? I mean, a PUE number in Europe compared to an Asian PUE number, for example, a Singapore number, it doesn't match, it doesn't fit. It's completely different realities. So it's almost the case, like you said, we only evaluate these things on a PUE basis, on the actual benefit of the data center to the local community, and to the point of the heat reusal and the grids. A lot of the infrastructure is not built on the grid front. I mean, if you go to Southern Europe, there's no infrastructure built to send heat to even to a local pool, let alone to the housing pipelines.
I know in Barcelona, you've got a nice LNG regasification plant that's desperate for your heat so that they can regasify their LNG. And I think there are other trends, things like liquid cooling and stuff, that allow you to recover waste heat at much higher return temps than you could. And if you're able to recover heat at like 60, 70 C, then you can start to think about running things like absorption chillers. So I don't think that it's heat recovery and reuse is something that only applies in Northern Europe, which I think we often kind of have historically thought about. I think it's just as valid in Southern Europe as well. But I'm sure the other guys have thoughts. Certainly, Matthew, I'm sure, has thoughts around that.
Yes, I have thoughts. It's
we hope so.
It's an interesting one. I think it's been in discussion for a while. I've seen some use cases. I've seen some examples where people have made use of this waste heat. And I think it's but it's pretty unique at the moment. Regulation will probably dictate that there's got to be something around the use of it or the reuse of it somewhere, somehow. And that may certainly dictate the location and geographical nature of where we put data centers and what we can do with that waste heat. Or, as you said, David, the technology inside the data center utilizes that waste heat differently. And then actually we design data centers differently. And it's almost like a circular technology economy inside the data center. One or the other, I think, is tricky. Certainly, there's a bit of NIMBYism, so you don't want data centers by your residential areas to heat homes. I mean, that would be ideal in a way, or public offices and schools and things. But as we know, it's just not really viable that 500 megawatt data center campus is on the doorstep of a primary school or something like that. It's just
yeah, but I think we often focus too much on this idea of using waste heat for residential when there's actually 1,001 other uses for that heat. I love the things that the guys at Pure DC have been doing in the Nordics. You're using it for salmon farming of all things, and then you've got the use of it in vertical farming scenarios. There's lots of other things that the waste heat can be useful beyond the residential aspect. Maybe there's an argument to be had that says a data center should be in the middle of a big farm field, because if you then export the heat to support that farm to help it produce better crops, more crops for the population, and that's actually a good use of the land. But anyway,
but you're right, Tom. I think people are going to have to be imaginative and innovative here, because it's likely it will come through in regulation, right? With the European Commission, I suspect, for sure. So we're going to have to be creative. I don't think there's anything written about what you do with it necessarily. There are different grades of how you utilize it, and do you get special credits for utilizing it in one way versus another? I don't know, but that's to come, I guess, Tom. And people who are thinking about it now will obviously have a bit of a head start.
The important thing is that everybody on this call agrees. So the industry itself, our industry, we're all saying the same thing. We should be reusing our heat somehow, somewhere, sometime, as soon as possible. So we're all saying this. I think we're all saying the same thing here.
Yeah.
Question around PUE, right? I'd much prefer to have a data center with a PUE of 1.5 where I'm recovering and reusing 100% of my waste heat and heating a hospital, because essentially I'm displacing the load that hospital would be running their boiler, right? So it's fine heating the ocean and having some salmon farming, although I think salmon farming in that scale is bad for the environment generally, but it's better than probably having electric heaters in the ocean to farm salmon. But actually, if I'm displacing a hotel or a hospital loft or that would have been running a boiler, there's actually a negative carbon impact from my data center, right? So that's a massively powerful thing to be able to do. And actually, I think that really it's incumbent on us as an industry to make choices about where we build data centers based on us having neighbors who want the heat. And if I look at projects that we have under construction, every single one of those projects has a neighbor who will not all of our waste heat, right? So I'd love to be telling you truthfully that we found people to export 20 megawatts of waste heat. And look, there are some examples where we can, but all of our projects were able to export some of our waste heat. And that for us is just because we make that a criteria of site selection. So that's totally up to the industry. You can do it or you can not do it, right? But it's totally within your grasp to be able to do it. You just have to make different choices when it comes to selecting a site. And I think with respect to building a 500 megawatt data center next to a primary school, probably not, right? But if I went to a local council and said, hey, look, you've got a sports center or you've got a swimming pool, you've got a bit of land, you're not having as many people drive there now, why don't I build a data center in your car park and I'll use my waste heat to provide you essentially with free heating for your swimming pool, library, whatever. I think there are certainly in the UK many councils who'd be interested in the opportunity to not pay a heating bill and to lease a few car parking spaces to a data center operator. And of course, there's people like Deep Heat or Deep Green, I think, who are doing exactly that. So, and that's a small scale, but certainly I think that the trend is moving in that direction. And as operators, certainly it's incumbent on us to make sure that we are choosing actively to participate in that, not just hoping that someone will come along and want to use our heat, which of course is not realistic in some locations.
Yeah, it's like guys are saying, we will have to get creative on how to do this and have to be willing to do it as well. I think some operators still need to make their shifts from we can do it to actually doing it in that sense. And there's plenty of use cases. I mean, we have, for example, Qscale, even though it's in Canada, where they use the entirety heat reuse to farm tomatoes and other vegetables, which are then sent out to schools and community centers and everything. We have Equinix next year is going to warm up the Olympic pool in Paris with their data centers heat. So we were starting to have some nice use cases. And like you said, we will have to have use creativity to come up with different ones that we cannot even think about at the moment. But you've all mentioned the keyword of regulation. And I think that's kind of, that is actually the hot word for 2024, I would say, with everything that's going to come into effect in Europe within the first half of the year. So my question will be, I mean, to all of you, what sort of regulations should everyone be aware in Europe right now that's coming in 2024, and how is that going to shift could shift the landscape? I mean, we already mentioned that maybe in the future these things will dictate where data centers get built, which will, I don't know if it's a good thing, if it's a bad thing. We can also ask the question, but let's go through the regulation scenario now. So what should we be looking out for? And I'll let someone start.
CSRD, I'll kick off with that one. So Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive measurements started this year. The actual effect of those measurements will start taking impact in 2024. What I like about this is it's new. It's the first time, I think, that regulation in Europe has actually come into force. And not all, but most data center operators will have to abide by it, but not all, because there are certain sort of key benchmarks you've got to achieve before you have to report on it. I'd like to think that those data center operators that don't fall within the criteria that mean you have to report on this reporting directive, I'd like to think that they would see it as a best practice anyway. But for me, what I like most about it is it's starting to measure multiple facets of sustainability, not just PUE. It's looking at a whole plethora of attributes within industries, not just data centers, but across commercial industries. And if you yourself think you're not doing particularly well against some of these metrics, that's a good thing. You can start now putting things in place that you can measure against a consistent number. You started off at X. We want to make improvements of X plus 5 or X plus 10 or whatever you decide as a business. So as opposed to it being a stick to beat yourself up with as an organization, I like to think of CSRD as a initiative, as a regulation that should, over time, enable people to see and companies to see just how well they are performing and behaving, and then make improvements against that. If you're not measuring it, you can't do anything about it. So that would be my starter for 10.
Yeah. I think the measuring is very important, and of course the reporting as well. And then I'll add a third dimension, which is actually understanding the data, and who's reading it needs to understand it, especially policymakers. But Davey, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I go with Tom. I mean, you've got the Energy Efficiency Directive from the European Union as well. I mean, these are similar and coupled with what Tom's saying. You know, there's got to be transparency in reporting from data center operators now. And I think it's very important that takes place. There's still some the industry needs to eventually agree on what the reporting looks like and what are we reporting, and who to as well. Of course, I mean that's. We're getting there, and I know the EU DCA is working on this quite actively with the European Commission. Self-regulation is something we would like to do as an industry, certainly. If not, then a form of it, which means we actually come together as one voice, and we have that, and the voice in front of the European Commission is a coordinated voice. If we look messy as an industry, it's more likely that they'll do quite heavy top-down regulation when they don't really understand the industry that much. So I think I do see some active coordination activity with a lot of operators in Europe with the EU DCA in this space, and the EED was influenced, let's say, by the European Data Center Association to a certain extent, for sure. It certainly had its say. So we need to continue on this path. I think we need to work together. We've got to eventually, at some point soon, agree on what those measurements are and what they look like. But it's going to be key, I think. And it's going to be interesting how people take this on board and when they take it on board. I believe data centers need to be climate neutral by 2030. That's and the EDCA is working on a climate neutral data center pact to really gather the thoughts, gather the intellectual property of the operators on how we can all collectively achieve that. So we've started in 2023, as Tom said. It's going to ramp up in 2024 all the way to 2030 and probably beyond. But I think in general, this industry can give itself a pat on the back anyway, because it's strive towards sustainability, energy efficiency, let's say, helps the bottom line anyway, and it helps differentiate them, and it helps you win business, and investors like it. So all of that put together, I think we're on a good path. But regulation is going to come in Europe and will follow in other places, but it may be different. You talked about the US. What are you going to do with all that waste heat? Well, they probably won't regulate on it then, because there's not much, as you said, perhaps you can do with it. But we have the climate accord from the iMasons, and all of these organizations will come together and are working together to make sure that we have something that's sensible, and that we have one voice in front of the regulators, I think is important.
That's interesting. I was actually chatting to the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact guys earlier this week, and the amount of groundwork that has been done this year alone, it's quite extraordinary. So I'm expecting big things next year in terms of actual visible, palpable reports and announcements and news and actions. Not lobbying. They were very, very. They made sure I didn't say it was lobbying, but actually getting things off the paper onto the streets of Brussels to actually get action on the way. And David, give us your view as an operator.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I come at this more of kind of an engineering perspective. So I worry about the practical impacts of this legislation. Actually, I don't really worry about it, because the wonderful thing about Atlas Edge is that we have essentially a clean sheet. So rather than having to defend years of capital investment, I worry that legislation is going to cause me to have to invest pots of new capex in fixing. Actually, for us, it's a fantastic opportunity to just be really good from a sustainability perspective, and have that as a competitive advantage. But I mean, I suppose practically the things I worry about, the dynamic seems to be that people want lower PUEs, zero WUEs, and to get rid of all the nice refrigerants that used to make those things possible. Now, that's quite a hard circle to square, because typically the kind of, if you kind of think of those as things that pop up and down, as you push one down, the other two kind of pop up, and solving all three of them in one step is a really interesting challenge. So I think that's quite a big one, and certainly on the refrigerant side, that's really massive, because we've benefited from these quite sophisticated refrigerants that enable us to do lots of really interesting things, and have low PUEs and zero water usage. But getting rid of those and replacing them with butane and propane makes zero WE and low PUE quite hard. So that's an interesting one, and I'm not quite sure anyone's quite squared that circle. And the other big one that I think no one's really talking about, but it's massive, I'm sure Matthew can talk more about it knowledgeably than me, is the banning of SF6. So, SF6 essentially is what we have in all of our breakers. I know Schneider Electric have these lovely vacuum breakers, so they've solved the problem, at least for Schneider Electric customers. But there is a whole bunch of electrical breakers that and Nike Air Plus Max shoes as well. But they all rely on this gas that's being banned that no one really talking about. But that's massive, right? So I mean, think about the two things that we care about in data centers. Electrical distribution is pretty important, and cooling is quite important. And both of those really key systems are already being penned in terms of how we design and manage them. So I think that there's a big shock coming, frankly, for perhaps some unsophisticated investors who've invested in properties that have a kind of headline PUE of 1.3, who meets the objective of their green fund. But oh, by the way, it's got a really high WUE. It's maybe in an area with climate stress, and it's got all these breakers full of SF6 that are going to need to be replaced. So there's quite a lot of capital investment coming, I think, in the sector, potentially, and actually sometimes replacing some of this infrastructure in an existing site is significantly more expensive than building a new one. So I think that the dynamic that I think is really interesting is how some of the incumbents are going to deal with really going to their investors and saying, actually, we've got really significant capital requirements, and that's not going to add more capacity. It's not going to make the site operate more efficiently. Actually, it might increase our PUE, but it's going to keep us on the right side of the law. So certainly, I think that's a really interesting dynamic, and I'm looking forward to see how that one plays out. Now I'm not at one of those large incumbents anymore.
No, those are interesting points, and I mean, there's a lot of conversation as well around the investments into sustainability. And how much money was poured into the industry over the last 2-3 years, and how some operators are having to renegotiate those terms because things have not been achieved on what they agreed. So there's something that apparently it's happening in the backstage as well, and it'll be interesting to see what happens and if that's going to impact the 2030 goals of some of the larger players. I was going to ask as well, so because I mean we've of course gone through some of the up and coming markets, we've gone through sustainability a little bit, regulations, but then of course AI is the other big words that in 2023. It's probably the word of 2023 really is AI. Well, two words: artificial intelligence. How do you see AI really affecting the development in a good way, the development of data centers towards secondary locations? And what other trends are you seeing beyond, of course, sustainability, power, AI? Is there something else happening, lurking underneath, that's driving an operator into a next location?
It's a fascinating topic, the AI one. I had a breakfast seminar on this before it hit the press, but let's not kid ourselves. AI has been a topic of conversation for 15 plus years. When I was in the software industry, AI was a conversation, machine learning was real. So this isn't modern day stuff. It's just come up to the surface for everybody. The impact for the data center space, from my perspective, what I get fortunate enough to see is that it's writing a new chapter in terms of what it is we're expected to be doing to enable AI to evolve the way that the world seems to want it to go. If you follow the trend of the digital economy growth, plug AI into that, it's going to be exponential growth as a result of it. But it has created a new chapter that we have to all learn to write, read, and understand. That chapter being one where most likely, and the things we're seeing sort of go off faster than milk goes off in the fridge, as one of my colleagues reminds me every single day. AI is shifting and changing in real time. But one of the things I think we're going to see from a location perspective is it used to be location with power, in brackets. It's going to become where's the power, and the location actually can be far more flexible for these big, let's call them motherships, mega gigawatt sites. The learning centers where the brains evolve can pretty much be in the middle of nowhere. The inference sites can be back close to your typical locations, which is going to be a driver for increased demand in your typical locations. The third site location, I think this is where it maybe plays nicely into Atlas Edge's hands, is that we've been looking for a case study for the likes of the edge for a long time. I think that artificial intelligence is going to give us that edge case study in a deep way, in a meaningful way. That the inference sites based out of Frankfurt will be very helpful, will be necessary to execute whatever the mothership has created. But you're going to want that execution getting even closer to the people, whether it's through a lamppost in the car or through an edge data center that might only be 500 kilowatts, might only be a megawatt in size, but is servicing an artificial intelligence set of widgets to Porter's Head or somewhere else. So it's a fascinating chapter, I think, in the data center world, and it's one that continues to evolve.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said it'd been around for a while, Tom. My master's degree I finished in Edinburgh in 2003 in machine learning, and no one really believed me that I studied it, but now everyone I only did it to annoy my parents. There was no practical use of machine learning in 2003. And now, of course, so I agree with everything Tom said. I think there's an interesting challenge which is somewhat subtle in the training, is that the workload is very asymmetric. So we're kind of used to data centers having fairly consistent workloads, right? And that makes sense. If you're investing a ton of capital, whether you build it yourself or whether you're selling it to someone else, you essentially want that capital to be being used, right? If you build a UPS, you want the UPS to be under 70% load. Now, when I train like ChatGPT 5, right, and large language models are a bit of a toy, right? There'll be a new machine learning that's more interesting than large language models, but let's call it ChatGPT 5. There's a very, very high demand for power until there's not, right? Because I finished training and now I don't need it anymore. So if I built a 2 gigawatt site so I can train my model very quickly, there's a very kind of odd asymmetry in that workload. So it's why I disagree with Tom, actually, is because the hardware that you use for training and inferencing is the same. So whilst one could buy a lot of very expensive hardware, have it highly centralized, and because we always think about data centers as being really expensive things, but of course, actually the expensive thing is what you put inside the data center, right? So if I want my data centers to be working all the time, I sure as hell want my NVIDIA GPUs to be working all the time, because they're the real expensive thing. So what I definitely don't want is to go and build 2 gigawatts of GPUs in the middle of nowhere, train ChatGPT 5, and then have nothing to do, right? So actually,
I'm going to jump in quickly, David, because it's take ChatGPT. It's a great example because that's just what everybody talks about. There's far more artificial intelligence being built behind the scenes that we're not talking about. So, but take ChatGPT. To build ChatGPT 3, it took 10,000 GPUs, NVIDIA GPUs. The projection to build ChatGPT 6, and these are from NVIDIA now, the projection in terms of how many GPUs that's going to need is 10 million. 10,000 to 10 million.
In the same amount of time, right?
Yeah. The amount of power that's going to be consumed is going to be in the gigawatts. It's not just going to be for ChatGPT.
I agree with that, but from a hardware utilization perspective, the same GPU can do inferencing and training, right? So what's clear is that inferencing is going to have a much steadier state in terms of workload, right? Because if I have 100 CCTV cameras and they're all providing a feed to a GPU, and I want to recognize, someone getting, mugged in the street, right? Then that's a constant workload. So I know that workload exists all the time. So what might make more sense is, rather than doing the training centrally, right, which also has the challenge of having to move the data to the training, which could be really expensive, and there's a lot of data that's required to actually usefully train it. What might make more sense is to actually distribute the training as well, right? Because then the same hardware that's doing the inferencing is also doing the training. So rather than having a pool of hardware that sits there doing nothing, and I agree with you, you could build another model, right? So as long as I've got enough models being built, I could fill up my hardware.
Enough brain creations.
And look, honestly, probably the answer is a mixture of both of these things are going to happen. Right? There will be some highly centralized hubs, and then some smart engineer will find a way of
I will put a wager with anybody on this call right now that within the next 5 years, we are going to see some gigawatt sites for AI. You're going to also see plenty of inference expansions around your existing regions, around the existing zones. And I genuinely think you're going to see the edge at last having a reason and a way to take off bigger than it has to date. And that will be the ultra inference at the ultra edge locations. It's
Yeah, I
necessary.
agree with all those things. I agree with all
I
those
mean, I just
Cascade. Sorry, Matthew. Go on.
no. I'll let you guys have it. Just to say, I don't disagree with any of that. Of course, I mean, certainly, I didn't study machine learning, David, so I take your expertise on that. That's for sure. And real estate, Tom, you're the man, of course. Yeah, we're seeing similar, and we're hearing similar. We're talking to people, having similar conversations. You have the large learning models, and you have inference, of course. I think some numbers I've seen is the training model will be 15% of the total demand. Actually, the inference will be 85% of the total, whatever the total demand is, and by when it's a bit fuzzy, of course. The timing is a little bit fuzzy, but I do believe we will see locations like the Nordics be leveraged for the learning models for sure. And you said, David, yeah, what happens when the training model is finished? I mean, if we've got ChatGPT 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is there a ChatGPT 24? I don't know. Does it stop, or what else comes down the line? We don't know. But I think we have seen, or we are hearing that locations like Nordics will be used for learning models. And then the inference, David, I'm sure you'll come into play there, is a huge opportunity for us. It's just when that really starts to hit the ground and when that really starts to take off. What it does pose, though, you've talked about some of these, is technology and design challenges. I guess this is on the mind of Schneider Electric, for example, in what technology we need to develop to support these large loads. You talk about NVIDIA. I was chatting to them a few weeks ago. They've developed a 10U GPU that is 100 kilowatts that requires 100 kilowatts of power demand. You put that in a 42U rack, 4 of them, 400 kilowatts now. And they're not stopping, by the way, but we're not seeing 400 kilowatts at any stretch at the moment. But it's not beyond the wit of man to see maybe up to, some people are saying 60 to 80 kilowatts per rack of demand for these learning models. We need to change the way we design. We need to look at the way we design data centers. Cooling is going to be a big challenge, and maybe we see the emergence of liquid cooling. But proximity is one, technology and design is the other of these data centers. For sure, we're going to see a little bit of a shift, a bit fuzzy. We're still all trying to figure out, as you can tell by this call, where and when, I think, is the $64 million question.
I think the design piece is a really valid point you make there, Matthew, in the sense, I look back at the Facebook story that we were all horrified to see earlier this year. Facebook cancels all these build construction projects.
Yeah.
And then people suddenly, it dawned on them that actually they're not cancelling them, they're pausing them. And the reason they're pausing them is so that they can look at redesign. And the design piece of this whole conversation is so critical because, yes, you could put rear door cooling up to 60 kilowatts, but no, exactly. Yeah, as soon as you get beyond that, and I'm stretching it here at 40, 60, as soon as you get beyond, you've got to be looking at, how can you bring water? Shock horror. How can you bring water into a data center? Something you'd never talk about 5 years ago. Today, people have got to talk about proper water coming direct to cooling chips.
But also, they did. I mean, the tier rating of these data centers. I talked to one hyperscaler, no names, nothing, of course. And they're alluding to the fact they are considering what their design looks like in terms of the tier rating for the learning model data centers, training data centers. Yeah. Do they need generators? Do they need UPS? Look, I don't want to say that sort of stuff because we sell UPSs, but it's just a matter of the fact that they're looking at the way they design data centers. Are they mission critical or not? Or are they like mining data centers? Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of considerations that people are looking at in terms of design, and the location may support them in the cooling as well. So, yeah, Tom, I agree with you. It's interesting. Yeah.
I think I agree with
probably typical. We say 3 plus, whatever tier rating that is. That's the mission critical side of the application.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with everything you said. And I was actually at a conference in Toronto a few weeks ago, and this was exactly one of the main topics of discussion. And there was so much discussion about several operators, not even just hyperscaler, even smaller than hyperscalers. They have had to change their designs within 6 months of them being designed. And they went back into the engineering board, the architecture board, just to really redevelop them, to be able to fit in all the new equipment and what's coming. And I think, Tom, what you were saying about the 5 years, I think it's going to be probably less than that, to be honest, for the gigawatt scale facilities. There's one already being built, which will be announced soon. which I will have the exclusive on that one. So they'll be
I was being sensitive to these things, João.
I'm not going to give more of that.
Yeah, I was being sensitive.
You've
But
got half gigawatt now in Portugal that I believe still has a half gigawatt of capacity 4 years later after it was announced. So I mean, probably location is still important, whether or not you're using it for machine learning or not.
At the present, it is. I think things will probably shift a little bit over the next 5-10 years, but it is. And I think the Nordics is quite interesting because it is really coming through a second coming. But guys, thank you so much for talking to me, David, Matthew, and Tom. That's all we have time for today, unfortunately, because this could last. It could be a days on end conversation, really. But on behalf of the speakers, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in, either here on LinkedIn, YouTube, X, or JSA.net. Our next session will take place in a week's time on November the 8th at 3 p.m. UK time, and we'll delve into the sustainability energy hubs of Europe and green data center development. Make sure you visit our LinkedIn page to sign up for November the 8th. And with that, we wrap up today's conversation. Look out for the playback of this session coming soon to JSA TV, YouTube, LinkedIn, X, and more. From me and the team at JSA Europe, happy networking.